We turn today to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. In our study through Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we said that this letter gives us a description of the characteristics of a carnal Christian, the attitudes and behavior that are found in spiritual babies, carnal Christians who have not grown to maturity. And we've been considering a number of them in our previous studies. In the last few studies, we considered chapter 5, where we saw the toleration of sin in the midst of the church, the ignoring of sin, the unwillingness to excommunicate and discipline a believer who lives in sin is another mark of a carnal Christian, because the devil has deceived him with a false understanding of God's love. In 1 Corinthians 6, we see another mark of carnal Christians, that when they have a problem, a difficulty with a fellow believer, they take the matter to the law courts, to unbelievers, to justify themselves. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 1. Would any of you, having a lawsuit against his neighbor, go before the unrighteous? A person who has a matter against his neighbor. That's the literal meaning, that a person has a difficulty, a dispute, problem with his brother, his neighbor, a brother in the church, dares to go to law before the unrighteous. That is a sinful pagan court, a court of unrighteous men, instead of committing the matter and laying it before God's people, the saints. Now this verse teaches us that when two believers have a problem, and that type of thing can easily arise, because we all have a flesh in which dwells nothing good, and not all believers have understanding of how to walk the way Jesus walked, of putting the flesh to death, and the way of the cross, the new and living way, and therefore they can have problems. There are babies in every church, and babies have problems. Spiritually minded people know what to do when they are tempted by a particular action or difficulty that comes up through another believer's attitude or behavior. But carnal Christians do not know what to do. A spiritual person knows that he must put his flesh to death and behave in a godly way. But a carnal person is all worked up, he's at unrest inside, and he decides to backbite, gossip, justify himself before other people. He may not go to a law court, but when he goes to other carnal Christians or other unbelievers and speaks evil about a believer behind his back and justifies himself, he's doing exactly the same thing that's spoken of in verse 1. And the multitudes and multitudes of believers who are living like this shows that there are multitudes of believers who are carnal Christians. Every person who, when he has a problem with another believer, goes to some other carnal Christian or to unbelievers and speaks evil about that brother and justifies himself is very clearly a spiritual baby and a carnal Christian, without a shadow of doubt, because he does not understand God's way to the solution to such a problem. And Paul says to these Corinthian Christians, he says, that's a terrible thing. Don't you know that one day the saints are going to judge the world? And you are going to the world and asking them to judge the saints. This is exactly the opposite. There's a day coming when God's people are going to sit on thrones to judge the world. But he says, if you people behave like this, you're certainly not fit to be sitting on those thrones in the reign of Jesus Christ on earth during the millennium. And he says, if the world is to be judged by you in that final day, are you not competent to constitute the trial of these smallest matters, to adjudicate and to try these most trivial cases? He says, if you can't sort out these small problems in your midst, how are you going to rule the world one day? And that teaches us that all the problems and situations we face on earth today are being used by God to prepare us to one day rule the world. We're told in Revelation chapter 2, in the last few verses of that chapter, that he who overcomes, to him will be given power and authority over all the nations. That is God's will. The Lord wants to give us authority over the nations, but He has to train us and make us fit to rule. We read about King Saul in the Old Testament, that he came straight to the throne without any period of testing or of trial or difficulty. He came straight to the throne and he made a useless king. But David, on the other hand, who succeeded him, came to the throne after a long period of trial and testing and difficulty and being proved by God, and therefore he made an excellent king. Both reigned for 40 years, but there was a vast difference between those two reigns. In the same way, there are people who are unfit to rule. There are others like David who are fit to rule. And so God allows us to go through trials and difficulties and problems of all types so that we can be fit to rule this world one day by the law of love and by the law of purity. God is light and God is love, and to understand that. And so he says further, not only the world, he says in verse 3, we're also going to judge angels. That's an amazing truth, that believers are going to judge the angels. Perhaps the angels who sinned are going to be finally judged by God's people. And this is something that Satan realizes and is part of the reason for his fury against believers, because he knows that one day God's people are going to judge him and the fallen evil spirits. And if this is true, how much more we should be qualified to judge in matters of this life? How much more we should be able to deal with these trivial matters that relate to material things? If we're going to judge in spiritual matters in the final day, how much more we should be able to judge in material things? And therefore he says in verse 4, if therefore you have such disputes in things pertaining to this life, material matters, do you set to judge then those who are least esteemed in the church, who are no account in the church? Are you going to entrust the jurisdiction to men who count for nothing in the church? Or as the Living Bible says, why go to outside judges who are not even Christians to sort out these problems? This is completely wrong. It's completely against the Word of God when a brother has a difficulty with a brother to go to a non-Christian judge and ask him to sort out that difficulty. What then is the solution? He goes on to say what the solution is. In verse 5, he says, I say this to your shame. I'm saying this deliberately, he says, to rouse your sense of shame. Think of your calling, one who is called to judge the world and to judge the angels in the final day, and now you are taking these matters of judgment to people who are children of the devil, in law courts, judges who are not even Christians, who are not born again. Is it really true, he says in verse 5, that there's not one wise man among you? They had many gifts, and one of the gifts mentioned in the letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 12, is the gift of the word of wisdom. It's possible to have the gift of the word of wisdom and yet not be a wise man. Because the word of wisdom is a word given at a particular time. But to be a wise man, one has to have walked the way of the cross for some length of time. It is through self-denial and humbling oneself that one becomes wise. And the sad thing is that there was not one wise man in the entire church in Corinth. They had plenty of Bible knowledge that did not make them wise. They had all the gifts of the Spirit, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 9, but that did not make them wise. That teaches us that Bible knowledge and the gifts of the Spirit do not necessarily make us wise. It does not make us spiritual. The characteristics of true wisdom are listed in James chapter 3 and verse 17, where he says the wisdom that is from above is first of all pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, and without hypocrisy. These are the marks of a truly wise man, of a truly spiritual man. But such a man was not found in the midst of the Corinthians. But brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers. And all the unbelievers, he says, are watching this that's going on in the local law court in Corinth, one brother accusing another brother. What a shame. The dishonor comes to Jesus Christ. It's exactly the same today. When unbelievers see brothers fighting with brothers, brothers accusing brothers, he says, this is a defeat for you. You are defeated when you have lawsuits with one another. This is something we must bear in mind, that Satan has got the victory when one brother is having a difficulty with another brother and he doesn't know how to resolve it. And he goes and backbites to someone else about it, or takes the matter to unbelievers instead of taking it to the elders of the church. He says this, it's so clear that Satan has got the victory and you are defeated. When he says in verse 7 you are defeated, what he means is Satan has got the victory. And therefore, let's take care that we do not make the same mistake in our lives.